Thank you. It's funny when you get into the methane business, and I'll jump into this in a second. But there's just a big correction I have to issue, and I was really sad about this because I started chasing methane at the current company I'm working at, and what we learned, much to our chagrin, because it really took all the wind out of our fart jokes, is that it's actually cow burps, not cow farts, that produce all the methane. It was a really sad day. Okay, so this is the how-to stage, or it was. I want to talk about how to make a dent in the world, right? A little bit about who I am. I didn't know that you could have a job that actually made a difference in the world until I started working about 13 years ago at a place called SourceForge.net. For all you kids out there, that's GitHub before there was GitHub. It used to be the world's, now it's just an annoying sort of ad farm, but it used to be the world's largest repository of open source software. It was the place you would go to get open source. With a lot of friction, a lot of difficulty. I took care of it, and it was pretty amazing to have a job where I was like, oh wow, this is really good work. Which led me to the next place where I spent 10 years, Palantir, which is an enigma for a lot of people, but the important thing about Palantir is that Palantir is a place that is deeply, deeply mission-focused. It's all about finding hard, important problems in the world and doing whatever it takes to actually make a difference. Some of that work happens confidentially, some of it happens out in the open, but it was a place where I really learned the value of feeling like my work actually mattered. And in my journey there of 10 years, the thing that really kept me from even looking around, or when I did look around to think about doing other things, was finding something else to care about. And so about 6 months ago, actually, along the way, I managed to write this book, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, which is about one of the seminal problems of our time, how you handle data about people. You put that data into data systems, how you handle that responsibly that actually respects people's privacy and civil liberties. It's kind of a manual for mitigating damage in the future. But 6 months ago, I started becoming a privacy expert, and then I threw that career out, and I joined a startup called Kairos Aerospace, where we're chasing methane. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but literally moved on to the problem of solving and mitigating climate change. But I want to dispense some wisdom, and a quick note about wisdom before I actually dispense some. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I get on every stage and I keep expecting someone to throw me off, but it never happens. And this is the thing about people who have useful lessons. I'm just going to tell you about the stuff that I've learned, and hopefully it'll be useful. But I'm up here saying, I don't know, here's some stuff that I've learned in the past 20 years. So I try to be as humble as possible about it. So I want to start by talking about denters, about people who actually have had huge impact in the world, and just choosing a few examples. One of my favorites, Edward Snowden, has nothing to do with startups whatsoever, saw a huge problem in the world, saw that he could act at great personal cost to sort of illuminate our understanding of things, and sort of stepped forward and did this thing that really fundamentally changed our understanding of how the modern world works. This guy, who will be on the stage a little bit later, Harper Reed, was in the startup space, working at a bunch of different startups, and decided that he found something that he thought was really important as a way to change the world, left his job as CTO of Threadless to go run OFA 2008, or the data team for OFA 2008. That's Obama for America, for those of you who live up here. And basically ran a startup inside a presidential campaign that's widely credited with being key to getting President Obama elected the first time. Very cool guy. You'll enjoy it when he's up here. And then, of course, Mr. Startup, right? Iron Man, Elon Musk, who. But the important thing is not that he's Mr. Startup. The important thing is that if you look at all of the things that he's working on currently, they're all related to saving humanity in one way or another. Like literally, the whole point of Tesla is to get us off of carbon-based fuels. Solar City is renewable generation of power, and SpaceX is getting us the fuck out of here in case we need someplace else to go. So they're all sort of related to the exact same thesis. It's not about building the companies that make money. He does that, but it's about changing the world. So I want to bring up maybe an idea that is kind of interesting to bring up here, and that is that startups suck. I've worked at a lot of different startups. A lot of people think they want to have a startup. A lot of times they don't even know why they want to have a startup, and So there's a lot of zeal around startups without fully understanding what they're good for or why you should do it. And this is apparent to people outside the startup ecosystem, right? So this is, a place to look for truth is in satire, especially good satire. So this is Mike Judge talking about his research for Silicon Valley, right? That's the first thing you notice. It's capitalism shrouded in the fake hippie rhetoric of we're making the world a better place, because it's just uncool to say, hey, we're crushing it and making a lot of money, right? This is the view of the world of Silicon Valley, specifically in the startup ecosystem in general. They sum it up, of course, in the show in the great words of Gavin Belson. I don't want to live in a world where someone makes the world a better place, better than we do, right? And this is like a real criticism. And I personally believe that startups specifically, but people in general, can be a force for good in the world very, very earnestly. And so that's really what I want to talk about today, right? So startups are a how. They're a way to solve a problem. They're not a why, right? They're not a reason to do. They're not a reason to do anything unto themselves, right? And so what you really need to do is start with why. Figure out what the problem is that you're trying to solve, and maybe a startup is the right answer. Obviously, if you're Ed Snowden, not the right answer. If you're Elon Musk, always evidently the right answer. If you're Harper Reed, it's sort of doing something like a startup, but it's not exactly a startup, right? So start with why. Figure out what is the change that you actually want to see in the world. It may actually be a startup, but then figure out how to execute against that, right? And it's easy to have a lot to say that the notion that a startup, a small group of dedicated people can actually change the world is hubris, but this is the reason why it is not hubris, right? Information technology, computers, are the most powerful tool ever built by humanity. If you measure the orders of magnitude difference that you get from using computers for an information problem against what we can do ourselves, it vastly outstrips things like supertankers, which are from the last revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And so if you can harness, and we can today stand on the shoulders of giants, right? We can use things like AWS, we can use things like a whole open source ecosystem and just do a little bit of work to steer a whole bunch of infrastructure at a particular problem that we understand, there is the ability to really, really move the needle on the entire world. So there's no reason to think that it's not possible. So where do you go to find good? How does one go to do this? And I think there's a lack of imagination that sometimes people suffer, and they look in the wrong places. So I like to think about the world being filled with a lot of gray areas where there's a lot of bad or a lot of things that aren't really clear to us how they're good as the right place to go. And because the mistake that we make is often practicing guilt by association, things that we don't want to be associated with. So we say, it works like this. X is bad for the world. Could be oil companies, could be a particular country, could be a policy, could be replacing taxi drivers, whatever it is that you think is bad for the world. And then you say, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with that. I don't want people to think bad things about me because I don't want to be associated with those things. So instead, what I'm going to do is build an app that helps first-time entrepreneurs pitch to seed funders, right? Just totally have a total failure of imagination to be able to just navel gaze on some app that says, I don't care about the problems of the world, right? It's the wrong way to do it. Bad, the places where there is bad is where good is needed the most, right? And so the right reaction is to say, X is bad for the world. If I can make X less bad, even just a little bit, I'm doing good. And so the thing to do is then go engage with X, to go to whatever that place is where there's badness and say, I need to learn as much about this so that I can do some work to make it less bad, right? And this comes in a lot of different forms. There we go. Harm to people is a big one, right? Things that are bad for people in one way or another. And they're the way, like if you want to go work with people that harm people or organizations that harm people, what you're looking to do is harm reduction, right? This is actually what Kairos is doing, right? We're not about to get rid of hydrocarbon fuels anytime soon. What we need to do is figure out how to use hydrocarbon fuels in a way that has the least impact on this world, right? So we go and work with oil companies, places that some people think are just horrible, horrible places to work or work with because they do horrible things. I happen to think they're not evil. They fulfill a need that comes from the rest of the world, a demand that comes from the rest of the world, and it's our responsibility, their responsibility, to reduce that harm as much as possible until we have a better idea of what to do. Exclusion's a big one. The way you fight that is inclusion. And this is a thing that I actually see a lot, is that a lot of startup ideas are all for, call it maybe not just the 1%, but the 10%. You're like, well, if everybody has the newest, greatest smartphone, my app will be amazing. And then you forget that like 90% of humanity doesn't have that. And so anything that you're trying to build is excluded from what they're doing. And so the place that you can do amazing things is say, well, what can I do over SMS? So that I can go and reach all of Africa, where there isn't smartphone penetration, where there are huge populations that are excluded from the modern world. So inclusion is like a huge place to go. And then waste is another one. This is, Renee was, Haven is a great example of this. Renee it's all about efficiency in marketplaces. So efficiency gives us space to do other things. An example that she shared with me backstage is like palm oil is a thing that when you produce it is really bad for the environment. But a big part of the cost of palm oil is actually transport. So if you can reduce the cost of transport by about 20%, you can use that 20% to put into more sustainable farming techniques that reduce the harm, right? So efficiency either makes things cheaper, which just increases the wealth of the world, or it gives us room to do things in a more expensive way that are better for the world. And the last one, which is sort of the big one, is complexity. You can think about things that are actually just seem kind of complicated, but complexity is actually a good proxy for things that are just hard, right? Things that are hard but possible are things that just haven't been done yet because they're too complicated. And once you make them simple and bring them to the world, you've made it much more accessible, right? So it's all about simplify. And good examples of simplify we see in the tech world all the time. So GitHub is actually a great example of that. They've reduced the friction in sharing both open source and closed source software by building incredible UX around source control, right? Same thing with Twilio. They did that with what it takes to do telecom, to actually like do voice and messaging. They've done incredible work in that regard, and they've been rewarded, handsomely with a great IPO. Zipline, Tim did a really good job of stealing the thunder of both Renee and I. So Zipline is a great startup who's looking at drone technology and saying, how do we increase the accessibility, right? So Zipline actually can deliver things like blood and fresh medicine to places that don't have the infrastructure to either sustain it or transport it there. And so it actually sort of injects the modern world into places that are not currently included. 18F, which looks like a startup but isn't a startup, right? So 18F is, and the US Digital Service is part of the US government, started by Jen Palka, who is the head of Code for America. And the idea here is to bring a group of dedicated technologists into the government to make the government do a better job of its job, right? And Palantir has done a lot of really good work. It's documented elsewhere. You can go and find it. I no longer speak for this organization, but I can tell you there's great stories about the work that's been done there. And finally, Kairos. And this is where I am today. I started by two physicists who decided their why was, what are we going to do to make the world a better place? We love building things, putting it in space, but we want a problem that has some meat to it. So they looked and they said, you know what? I think we can do something about methane. And they spent 2 years in their garage in sort of a classic Silicon Valley story, literally building a brand new detector to be able to see methane, both from light aircraft and from space. I gave them some advice, did some initial investment with them, and then waited 2 years until it was ready. And then I left Palantir to go work with them, and now I'm sort of the third founder after the fact. I own the software side of the house. The thing to understand about methane is this. It's the blue line that goes all the way up. They're not actually on the same scale, but in terms of their percentage of the atmosphere, methane has gone up even more than CO2. And the bad thing about methane is that it absorbs about 84 times as much infrared energy from sunlight than CO2 does. So it's a really, really horrible greenhouse gas. Now, the cool thing about methane is if you burn it, it's actually a very clean, low-carbon fuel. And you're putting CO2 into the atmosphere instead of methane, and it actually reduces global warming that way. And the other cool thing about methane, which is not true of CO2, is that there's no reason to put it in the atmosphere. Currently, most of our power generation is done by burning carbon in one form or another, which generates CO2. And the world is like, we really should have less carbon in the atmosphere, except that we really like our electricity. So from a political standpoint, reducing CO2 is a little bit of a non-starter for all the rhetoric around it. But stopping methane, there's really no reason to put it into the atmosphere. And it's sort of systematically been underestimated. Every time someone goes and looks and says, how much methane are we leaking from oil and gas infrastructure? They say, oh, it's more than we thought. We don't know how much it is yet, but it's more than we thought. And a lot of the climate models basically show that if you can aggressively remove industrial methane, so that coming from oil and gas infrastructure, the warming trend drops from 0.2 to 0.5 degrees Celsius, depending on whose model you look at, by mid-century. By the end of the century, it's 1.1 degrees. So we're talking about a change of about a quarter to a half in the warming trend for the next 100 years if you just control methane. So we looked at this and said, wow, we should do something about methane. So this is a picture from West Texas taken on Tuesday from a light aircraft flying at 3,000 feet. My colleague Landon Blair was in the plane. I think this is a fracking site. We haven't actually looked up what it is yet. This is a wastewater pond that you would use from fracking. Think right in the center might be the well, or the well's over here, and here's a tank farm. And that sort of blue stuff that you see on there, that's sort of background levels of methane, and the big yellow spot in the center, that's where we see a huge cloud of methane coming from the site. We imaged it 2 days in a row, and clearly it's leaking. We're going to contact who it is and figure out if they can become our customer and tell them, hey, you've got a leak here. But we're up and running, and we now have a new way to see methane. We can do it from low-flying aircraft if we need to. We can put it up on a satellite. That's actually the original plan. We get about 100-meter resolution for something like this. Right here, you can see it's about 4-foot resolution. With 100-meter resolution, all we need to really tell people is where to send the pickup truck. You have this enormous leak. Turns out that about 90% of the leaking methane comes from big leaks, not little ones. And we have detectors that can see big leaks that are sort of out in the middle of nowhere and no one sees for 6 months. So this is hard to do, by the way. Like doing the science, figuring out how to get T signal out of a little bit of some infrared photons hitting a CCD. Luckily, I work with a bunch of physicists who take care of that, and then they're like, AWS, what is that? And I'm like, don't worry, it's fine. We make a good team. I feel blessed to be able to do this work. Right? I have no idea if we're going to be successful. We're a 10-person startup. We've just been through basically our second seed funding round. We have about a year to get market traction, so I'm in the same boat as everybody else. But we have the opportunity, if we're successful, to really transform the way that methane is regulated worldwide. And if these leaks get fixed, we can actually make the world a cooler place than it was going to be. So I'm pretty happy about that. I want to encourage you all to go out and figure out how to make your own dent in the world. And know that it's possible. Hopefully not with an asteroid, because that would fucking kill us all, but it makes a really cool graphic. If you have any questions about this stuff, come and find me afterwards. I'm happy to talk about it. Thanks for listening. Hopefully it was useful.